The wind tasted of rust and distance. It was the first thing Evelyn Hart noticed about the town of Redemption. A taste that scoured the back of her throat and settled deep in her lungs. It carried the fine red dust that was the town's lifeblood and its curse, a constant haze that blurred the edges of the hard, sun-bleached buildings and coated the tongues of its inhabitants. Redemption. The name was a bitter joke, a signpost to a promised land that turned out to be just another circle of hell, only drier. Evelyn drew the worn woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, a useless gesture against the oppressive heat. The fabric, once a deep forest green befitting a lady from the east, was now faded to the color of moss and filmed with the ubiquitous dust. She had been riding for weeks, trading comfort for anonymity, selling trinkets for hardtack and a place in a stable, all to put as much country as possible between herself and Philadelphia, between herself and Silas Croft. His face, framed by thick silver-streaked sideburns, haunted her waking moments. It was a face of polite, unyielding possession. He had not courted her. He had appraised her, as he would a seam of coal or a new locomotive. Her father, a geologist with more dreams than sense, had seen Croft as a patron. Croft had seen her father's detailed maps of undeveloped territories as a dowry, and Evelyn as the pretty, well-bred seal upon the transaction. Her refusal had been met with a calm, chilling smile. "My dear Evelyn," he had said, his voice as smooth and hard as polished granite, "some things are not a matter of choice. They are a matter of contract." So she had run, with the clothes on her back and her father's leather-bound portfolio of maps tucked deep in her satchel. The maps were her only inheritance, her only leverage in a world that saw her as little more than property to be claimed. Redemption's main street was a single, wide scar of trampled earth flanked by a dozen or so buildings leaning on each other for support. A saloon, a smithy, a sheriff's office with a faded sign, and the largest structure, Henderson's General Mercantile. It was her last chance. Her water was nearly gone, and her food supply was a handful of dried apples. She tied the reins of her weary mare to the hitching post, the leather creaking in the stark silence. The town watched her. Eyes peered from behind dusty window panes, and a man whittling on a porch let his knife fall still. They weren't hostile, not yet. They were simply curious, in the way a coyote is curious about a wounded rabbit. Strangers were either trouble or the victims of it, and either way, it was best to keep one's distance. The bell above the mercantile door gave a weak, tinny jingle. The air inside was thick with the mingled scents of coffee beans, cured leather, pickling brine, and dust. A man with a bald head and a sweeping gray mustache stood behind a long wooden counter, polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better days. He looked up, his eyes passing over Evelyn, noting the fine cut of her travel-stained dress, the exhaustion pinching her features, and the fear she was trying so hard to conceal. "Afternoon," he said, his voice flat. He was Mr. Henderson, the sign out front proclaimed. "Good afternoon," Evelyn replied, her voice huskier than she intended. She cleared her throat. "I need to purchase some supplies. Flour, salted pork, coffee, and a full canteen, if you please." Henderson nodded slowly, setting the glass down. "Got all that." He didn't move. Passing through. Yes, the lie felt thin in the heavy air. "Long way from wherever you're from," he observed, his gaze lingering on the worn but still elegant stitching of her cuffs. "It is," she agreed, offering nothing more. She slid a few coins onto the counter, careful not to show how little she had left. "If you could just pack them for me." Before he could answer, the bell jingled again, more forcefully this time. Two men filled the doorway, blocking the afternoon light and casting long, predatory shadows into the store. They were rough men, smelling of stale sweat and cheap whiskey. The taller one had a long, drooping mustache and a cruel twist to his lips. The shorter, stockier one had small, piggish eyes that roved over Evelyn with a look of smug satisfaction. "Well now, Jeb," the tall one drawled, a grin spreading across his face. Looks like our little songbirds finally decided to roost." Evelyn's blood ran cold. She recognized them from a stagecoach stop 2 days back. She had thought she'd lost them in the canyons. She straightened her spine, forcing a calm she did not feel. "I believe you are mistaken. You don't know me." "Oh, we know you. Miss Hart, the shorter one." Jeb grunted. He took a step forward, and Evelyn instinctively took one back. "Mr. Croft sent us. He's very eager for your return." He held up a rolled parchment, tapping it against his palm. "Got the paperwork right here. All legal and binding." Henderson, the proprietor, suddenly found the shelf of canned peaches behind him intensely interesting. He turned his back to the scene, his shoulders hunched. "That is a private matter," Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly. "It is not a warrant." "Better," the tall one sneered. "It's a contract. A marriage contract, to be precise. Makes you his property. Fair and square. We're just retrieving what's his." He lunged for her arm. Evelyn cried out and stumbled backward, knocking over a barrel of nails that scattered across the floorboards with a deafening clatter. She scrambled away, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it, the end of her desperate flight for freedom. They would drag her back to Philadelphia, back to Silas Croft, and her life would be over. The bell on the door jingled a third time, so softly it was almost lost in the aftermath of the crash. A man stood there, silhouetted against the harsh glare of the sun. He didn't enter so much as materialize in the space, moving with a fluid silence that was startling in a place defined by creaking wood and shuffling boots. He was tall, but not overtly large, with the lean corded build of someone whose strength came from use, not show. His face was angular, weathered by sun and wind, and framed by straight black hair tied back at the nape of his neck. His eyes, dark and steady, took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance. Evelyn, cornered and terrified. The two men, advancing on her with greedy confidence. Henderson, pretending to be invisible. He took a step inside, and the floorboards didn't groan. His boots were worn soft. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a plain cotton shirt. The dust of the trail settled into every seam. A pistol was holstered at his hip, but his hands were relaxed at his sides. He moved toward the counter, his gaze briefly meeting Evelyn's. There was no pity in it, but there was a deep, unsettling stillness, like the calm at the center of a storm. "Henderson," he said, his voice a low baritone, quiet but carrying in the tense room. "I need grain for the roan." Henderson turned, a look of profound relief on his face. "Tom, good to see you. Right away." He scurried to the back of the store, eager to be anywhere else. The two bounty hunters paused, annoyed by the interruption. The tall one glared at the newcomer. "This is private business, friend. Best you move on." Tom Greyhawk let his gaze drift from the man to the parchment he still held. "That piece of paper," he said, his tone conversational. "It has a judge's seal from this territory." The man, Jeb, scoffed. "It's a contract from Philadelphia, signed and witnessed." "Philadelphia is a long way from here," Tom observed. "Laws are different. Land's different. A piece of paper written back there doesn't mean much when the wind blows hard enough." He took another slow step, placing himself subtly between the men and Evelyn. "And in this territory, a woman isn't a horse. You can't claim her with a bill of sale." The tall one's hand drifted toward his gun. "I'm warning you, Cole Rourke won't be happy if we come back empty-handed on account of some local hero." The name Rourke hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Tom's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something, a distant memory or a fresh resolve, hardened his eyes. "Rourke knows where to find me if he has a complaint," Tom said, his voice dropping even lower. "But you two won't be taking the lady. Not today." "That's where you're wrong," the tall man snarled, and his hand moved. It was over before it began. Tom didn't draw his pistol. His left hand shot out, catching the man's wrist in a grip of iron, twisting it at an unnatural angle. A choked cry of pain escaped the man's lips, and his fingers flew open, the gun clattering to the floor. Simultaneously, Tom's right foot swept out, hooking Jeb's ankle as he lunged forward. The stocky man went down hard, his head connecting with the wooden counter with a sickening thud. He lay still, groaning. Tom released the tall man's wrist, shoving him back. The man cradled his arm, his face pale with pain and shock. He stared at Tom not with anger, but with a new, raw fear. He had expected a gunfight, a loud and messy affair. He had not been prepared for this silent, brutal efficiency. "Now," Tom said, his voice unchanged, "you can pick up your friend and your gun, and you can ride out of Redemption, or you can stay. Your choice." The tall man scrambled to obey. He grabbed his pistol and hauled his groaning partner to his feet. Without another word, they stumbled out of the store, leaving a trail of dust and humiliation in their wake. The silence that descended was absolute. Evelyn stood frozen, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Henderson slowly peeked out from behind a sack of flour. Tom Greyhawk turned to her. His dark eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw a hint of weariness in them. He was a man who had seen too much of this kind of ugliness. "They'll be back," he said. It wasn't a question, or others like them. Evelyn nodded, unable to find her voice. She wrapped her arms around herself. He was right. Croft would not give up. He would send more men, harder men. Rourke. The name itself felt like a threat. "This town won't help you," Tom continued, his gaze flicking toward Henderson, who immediately busied himself again. "They have their own troubles. They won't take on yours." "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, the words a confession of her own failure. Tom was silent for a long moment, studying her. He saw not just a frightened woman, but the steel that had gotten her this far. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the desperate will to survive. "I have a ranch," he said finally, the offer laid out as plainly as a stone. "North of here, place called the River Bar. It's isolated. You could stay there for a while, until you decide what to do next." Evelyn stared at him, her mind reeling. She had just escaped one man's claim only to be faced with an offer of shelter from another. Her instincts screamed at her to trust no one, to rely only on herself. But her instincts had led her here, to this dusty store, cornered and helpless. She looked at this quiet stranger. He hadn't swaggered or boasted. He had simply acted. He had spoken of the law, of what was right. He had not laid a hand on her, had not even looked at her with the possessive hunger she had come to expect from men. His eyes were steady, his offer unadorned with promises or conditions. It was a risk, perhaps the greatest risk of all. But what was her alternative? Waiting in this town for the next set of hunters to arrive, fleeing into the desert with half a canteen of water. Her gaze met his. Why, she asked, the single word holding all of her fear and suspicion. Tom Greyhawk looked away for a second, toward the blinding light of the doorway, as if seeing something on the far horizon. "Because no one," he said, turning back to her, "deserves to be owned." In the stark simplicity of his words, Evelyn heard not a proposition, but a principle. It was a language she understood. It was the very creed she was trying to live by. She took a slow, deliberate breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. It still tasted of rust, but now, mixed in with it, was the faint, fragile scent of hope. "All right," she said, "I'll come with you." Tom Greyhawk paid for his grain and Evelyn's hastily gathered supplies with a quiet finality, his presence a shield around her. He said nothing as they exited the store into the oppressive glare of the afternoon. The men who had accosted her were gone, vanished as if swallowed by the dust. The town, too, seemed to hold its breath, its few visible inhabitants finding sudden, urgent business elsewhere. Redemption wanted no part of this. Evelyn was a problem, and Tom Greyhawk had just claimed it. The ride out of town was silent. Tom led the way on a powerful roan, while Evelyn's mare followed, her own weariness mirroring her rider's. Once they cleared the last of the ramshackle building, the world opened up into a vast, unforgiving panorama of baked earth and hardy sagebrush. The sky was an immense, pale blue canvas, and the sun a relentless hammer. In the far distance, a bank of bruised purple clouds hinted at a dust storm, a slow-moving mountain of grit that would scour the landscape by nightfall. For the first hour, the only sounds were the plodding of hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the ceaseless whisper of the wind. The silence was a thing of substance, a third presence on the trail. Evelyn, accustomed to the clatter and chatter of Philadelphia, found it unnerving at first, but as the miles fell away, she began to notice other things. She watched Tom, who rode not on his horse, but with it, a seamless union of man and animal. He sat tall but relaxed, his body moving with the rhythm of the gait, his dark eyes constantly scanning the horizon, reading the land like a text she could not comprehend. He was a part of this place, as rugged and unadorned as the rock formations that broke the monotony of the plains. She knew, was watching her as well, not with an intrusive stare, but with quick, peripheral glances. He noted the way she held the reins, the set of her shoulders, the way she flinched when a hawk cried out overhead. He was assessing her, gauging her limits. She felt like a specimen under glass, a fragile eastern finch brought into a land of eagles. The thought stiffened her resolve. She would not be a burden. She would not be weak. They passed a small herd of wild horses, their coats the color of the dun-colored earth, their manes and tails streaming in the wind. They watched the riders with wild, intelligent eyes before turning and thundering away, a living embodiment of the very freedom Evelyn craved. The sight sent a pang of longing through her so sharp it was almost a physical pain. As the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the prairie, the ranch came into view. It wasn't nestled in a gentle valley, but stood starkly on a wide, flat bar of land that sloped down to a meandering, willow-choked river, the River Bar. The name was as plain and functional as the place itself. The fences were sturdy, the barn was large and well-constructed, and a corral held a half-dozen fine-looking horses that lifted their heads and whinnied a greeting. It was a place of work, of order, of stark survival. The house itself stood a little apart, a simple, rectangular structure of hewn logs and a sod roof. It was solid and unpretentious, but as they drew closer, Evelyn felt a strange chill despite the day's residual heat. There was a stillness about it, an emptiness that had nothing to do with size. Tom swung down from his roan and moved to help her, but she was already dismounting, eager to prove she wasn't helpless. Her legs, stiff from the long ride, nearly buckled, and she caught herself on the saddle. Tom's hand hovered near her elbow for a moment, then retreated. "Stable your horse," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "There's fresh hay and a trough in the barn." He took the supplies and walked toward the house. Evelyn led her mare into the cavernous barn, the air thick with the sweet, earthy smell of hay and horse. She unsaddled the animal with practiced movements, rubbing her down and murmuring soft words of encouragement. It was a comfort to perform the familiar task, a small anchor of normalcy in a sea of overwhelming newness. When she finally entered the main house, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the single large room was filled with the gray light of dusk. Tom was lighting a kerosene lamp on a simple plank table. The flame sputtered to life, casting a warm, flickering glow that only served to accentuate the room's profound emptiness. The space was clean, almost unnervingly so. A stone hearth dominated one wall, its surface scrubbed clean of soot. A few iron pots hung from hooks. The table was flanked by two sturdy chairs. Against the far wall was a bunk, its wool blanket folded with military precision. There was a shelf with a few books, a dry sink, and a set of pegs for coats. And that was all. There were no photographs on the rough mantelpiece, no carvings on the wooden beams, no braided rugs on the floor. There was no clutter, no sign of hobby or whimsy, No hint of a life lived within these walls beyond the bare necessities of existence. It was a shelter, not a home. It felt like a place a man would wait in, not live in. The silence inside was deeper than the silence of the prairie. It was the silence of absence. Tom gestured to a smaller room off to the side. "You can take that one." Evelyn peered inside. It held another simple cot and a small washstand. "Thank you," she said, her voice small in the quiet room. They ate a meal of salted pork and hard biscuits in near silence. Evelyn, driven by a desperate need to fill the void, tried to make conversation. "You have a fine ranch. Do you run it by yourself?" "Mostly," he replied, not looking up from his plate. "The horses in the corral are magnificent. They're good stock." His clipped responses were not rude, merely final. They were walls, and she lacked the strength to climb them. The meal ended, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Evelyn felt a familiar despair begin to creep in. She had fled one cage only to find herself in another, a cage of silence and isolation with a man who was as remote as the distant stars. She was a guest, a piece of baggage, a problem he had taken on for reasons she couldn't fathom. The next morning, she woke with a firm resolve. She would earn her keep. She found Tom already gone, a pot of coffee left warming by the hearth. The gesture was both thoughtful and distancing. After a meager breakfast, she explored the grounds. Behind the house, she found what she was looking for, a small, fallow patch of earth protected by a low stone wall. It had once been a garden. Weeds choked the soil, but the rows were still visible. It was a ghost of an effort, another sign of a life abandoned. Working with a rusty spade and a hoe she found in the barn, Evelyn began to reclaim the plot. The work was brutally hard. The sun beat down on her, and the dry soil resisted her efforts. Blisters rose on her soft hands. Her back ached, and sweat stung her eyes. But with every weed she pulled, with every clod of earth she turned, she felt a sliver of her own agency returning. She was not just waiting. She was building. For days, this became their rhythm. Tom would rise before dawn and work the ranch, breaking horses, mending fences, his presence a constant, silent force on the periphery. Evelyn worked in the garden, cleaned the empty house, and took over the cooking. Her first attempts were disastrous, but she learned to manage the temperamental hearth, to make passable bread, to stretch their meager supplies. One evening, she found a pile of his mended clothes sitting on her cot, her own clumsy stitches replaced by neat, strong ones. There was no note, no word of acknowledgement. The act was its own silent, complex communication. One afternoon, seeking refuge from the oppressive heat, she saw him by the water pump near the barn. He had stripped off his shirt to wash away the day's grime, and she saw it. A long, pale scar that slashed diagonally across the hard muscle of his chest, from his left collarbone down toward his right hip. It was an old wound, silvery and puckered, a stark white line against his sun-darkened skin. It was not the scar of an accident. It was the mark of a blade, a wound meant to kill. Suddenly, the empty house made a terrible kind of sense. The silence, the lack of personal effects, the haunted stillness in his eyes, they were all echoes of a loss so profound it had hollowed him out, leaving only this functional shell of a man. He must have seen her staring. He reached for his shirt, his movements quick and guarded, pulling it on and turning away, breaking the moment. The wall between them, which had seemed to be thinning, was suddenly higher and more impenetrable than ever. He grew more distant in the days that followed. The quiet between them became strained, heavy with unspoken things. Evelyn knew her presence was a constant reminder of a world he had tried to shut out. She feared he was beginning to regret his offer, that soon he would ask her to leave. The thought terrified her. The little garden she was nurturing, the sense of purpose she had found in her daily labors, it was a fragile foothold, and she could feel it slipping. The breaking point came a week after she saw the scar. He returned at dusk from a long ride along the property's edge, his face set in grim lines. He ate his supper without a word, his gaze fixed on the fire. The air in the small cabin crackled with tension. When he was finished, he pushed his plate away and finally looked at her, his dark eyes boring into hers. "Silas Croft," he said, his voice low and hard. "I need you to tell me everything. Not the story you tell strangers, not the parts you think are safe, the whole truth." The lamplight carved a small circle of warmth in the vast, silent dark of the cabin. Outside, the wind had picked up, a low moan that seemed to work its way through the chinks in the logs. Tom's demand hung in the air between them, sharp and unyielding as a shard of obsidian. The whole truth. It was a price she hadn't known she would have to pay, but looking at the hard-won stillness of his face, she understood it was the only currency that mattered here. To be offered shelter was one thing, to be granted an alliance was another entirely. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time in months, it was accompanied by a flicker of defiance. She would not be judged by this man. She had done nothing wrong but desire a life that was her own. "I need to get something from my satchel," she said, her voice steady. He watched her, his expression unreadable, as she went to the small room he had given her. From the bottom of her bag, beneath her few remaining clothes, she retrieved the leather portfolio. It was heavy, worn at the edges, the leather supple from years of her father's handling. It was the most tangible piece of him she had left. Returning to the main room, she placed it on the plank table between them. The sound was soft, but it landed with the weight of a confession. With trembling fingers, she untied the leather thongs and unrolled the first map. It was not a prospector's crude sketch, but a work of meticulous science and artistry, drawn in fine, precise ink lines on high-quality paper. It depicted a rugged stretch of territory, with contour lines indicating elevation, and a complex key of symbols denoting geological formations. Her father's script, small and neat, filled the margins with notes on strata, water sources, and mineral deposits. "My father was a geologist," she began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of him. "He loved this land, not for what he could take from it, but for how it was made. He believed the earth had a story to tell, written in rock and time." Tom leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table. His gaze wasn't on her, but on the map. He scanned it with an intensity that surprised her, a deep, innate understanding in his eyes. He wasn't seeing a path to riches. He was seeing the land he knew, translated into a language of lines and symbols. "He spent years out here, surveying for the railroad and for private investors," Evelyn continued. "Silas Croft was his primary patron. My father was brilliant, but he was impractical with money. Croft paid his expenses, funded his expeditions. In return, my father provided him with these," she gestured to the portfolio, "detailed geological surveys of undeveloped territories. Croft saw them as investments. My father saw them as his life's work." She paused, then unrolled a second map, this one depicting a series of sharp, jagged canyons. "This is the one Croft wants most." She pointed a finger to a specific area, where her father had drawn a dense cluster of symbols and written several lines of notes. He found an extensive system of quartz veins here, rich ones. He also noted other mineral deposits. He believed there was a fortune in that ground, not just in gold, but in other metals, too. Her finger traced over a small, unique drawing. He marked the location by a landmark, a column of rock shaped like a great bear rising on its hind legs. He said you couldn't miss it. Tom's eyes narrowed. He knew the place. It was a harsh, unforgiving piece of country, difficult to access, a place where a man could easily disappear. "When my father passed away," Evelyn's voice grew thick with remembered grief, "the maps became my inheritance. Croft, he did not make an offer for them. He simply assumed they were his. He saw my father as an employee, and the maps as company property. She drew a shaky breath, and he saw me as the simplest way to secure his claim. A marriage contract would be more than a union of families. It would be a legal transfer of ownership, of my father's legacy, of me. I was to be the final entry in his ledger, the acquisition that consolidated his assets. There it was, the whole ugly truth. She was not a runaway bride fleeing a broken heart. She was an escaped asset fleeing a corporate takeover of her life. Tom was silent for a long time, his calloused finger, scarred and browned by the sun, gently traced the ink line of a dry riverbed on the map. It was a stark contrast to the delicate, scholarly hand of her father. He was a different kind of man from a different world, yet he understood the map's implications more deeply than any of Croft's lawyers in Philadelphia. Finally, he looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers. "This isn't a map to a treasure, Evelyn," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It's a map to a war. Men like Croft don't share. They don't negotiate. They take, and they send other men to do the taking for them. Men like Cole Rourke." He spoke the name as if it were a poison he had tasted before. "The gold is a fever. It will burn everything it touches. This town, this land. Anyone who stands in the way." He leaned back, the simple movement conveying a world of weariness. He could tell her to go. He could take the map, burn it, and send her on her way, washing his hands of the trouble she had brought to his solitary doorstep. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. Evelyn could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of risks. Her own fate hung in the balance of his decision. But then he looked at her, at the defiant tilt of her chin, at the hands that were now calloused from her work in his garden. He saw not just a liability, but a woman who had fought, who had run 1,000 miles to claim her own life. And in her, perhaps, he saw an echo of a battle he himself had been fighting for years, a battle for a patch of ground, for a measure of peace, for the right to be left alone. "He will not stop," Tom said, more to himself than to her. "As long as he thinks you have this, he will send men. They will not be as clumsy as the last two." A new kind of silence settled between them. It was no longer the silence of strangers, but the quiet of two people staring down a common enemy. The dynamic had shifted. She was no longer just a refugee under his roof. She was the keeper of a dangerous secret, and he was the only one who understood the true nature of the threat. "So what do we do?" she asked, the word way hanging in the air, a fragile bridge built between them. A muscle tightened in Tom's jaw. He stood up and began to pace the length of the small cabin, his soft boots making no sound on the floorboards. He was a caged animal, but the cage was of his own making, a self-imposed exile he was now being forced to defend. He stopped at the hearth, staring into the dying embers. "We don't run," he said, his back to her. "Running is what he expects. We don't fight his way either. We don't have the men or the money." He turned around, and a spark of something sharp and intelligent had lit his eyes. "So we fight my way. With the land. It's the only ally we have that he can't buy." He came back to the table and looked down at the map, a new purpose in his stance. "Rourke is a brute, but he's not a fool. He'll be methodical. He'll try to get his hands on this map. So we'll give him one." Evelyn stared at him, confused. "You want to give it to them?" "A map," Tom clarified. "Not this one." A slow, grim smile touched his lips, a rare expression that transformed his hard features. "We'll make them a new one, a map that tells the story they want to hear, a map that leads them to a treasure of bad water, box canyons, and misery. We'll use their greed against them. We'll let the land fight for us." Hope, fierce and bright, surged through Evelyn. The plan was audacious, clever. It was a strategy born of a deep knowledge of the country and the hearts of greedy men. For the first time, she felt like she had a weapon. The cabin transformed into a workshop. Tom produced an old, half-empty ledger from a dusty chest. He carefully tore out a few blank, yellowed pages. Evelyn, Her artistic training from a lifetime ago, suddenly relevant, was tasked with the drawing. She studied her father's style, his unique symbols, the very slant of his letters. Tom brewed a pot of strong coffee, not for drinking, but for staining the paper, giving it the patina of age. They worked late into the night, their heads bent close together over the table in the small pool of lamplight. Tom would point to a spot on a blank page. Here, he'd murmur, is a maze of ravines. Put the bear-shaped rock at the entrance to it. He described dead-end canyons, alkali flats where a horse would go lame, and long, waterless stretches of sun-scorched rock. He was painting a picture of a fool's errand, a death trap disguised as a treasure map. Evelyn's hand was steady as she drew. She copied her father's neat lines, his scientific symbols, but she imbued them with the deadly information Tom provided. She was taking her father's legacy of knowledge and, with Tom's guidance, forging it into a shield. As she worked, she was aware of his closeness, the scent of leather and dust, the quiet sound of his breathing. The vast, empty space of the cabin seemed to shrink, filled now with their shared purpose. They were no longer two lonely people occupying the same space, but a team, a council of war with two members. By the time the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, it was done. The fake map lay on the table, a masterpiece of deception. It looked worn, authentic, and, most importantly, promised a fabulous reward for any man foolish enough to follow it. They had their plan. They had their weapon. A new, more practical problem asserted itself with the morning light. As Evelyn prepared their breakfast, the reality of their situation became clear. The flour sack was nearly flat. The coffee tin held only a few beans. The salted pork was gone. Their small fortress, their haven of strategic planning, was running out of supplies. Tom noticed her worried glance into the empty larder. "We need to go to town," he said, his voice flat, all trace of the previous night's collaborative energy gone, replaced by a familiar, stoic resolve. The words fell like stones in the quiet cabin. Town, redemption, a place of watching eyes, of fearful whispers, of men who could be bought. It was the one place they were most vulnerable. Their careful plan, their clever map. It was all for naught if they couldn't survive the week. They had to break their isolation. They had to walk back into the lion's den, knowing the hunters were circling closer every day. They did not go to town that day, nor the next. The sky, which had been a placid, washed-out blue, began to curdle, taking on a bruised, yellowish tint at the horizon. Tom watched it with a practiced eye, his gaze lingering on the unnatural stillness of the air. "Storm's coming," he announced, the two words carrying a weight of certainty that brooked no argument. A bad one. We'll have to wait it out. The waiting was a trial. With their supplies dwindling, every meal was a reminder of their vulnerability. The world shrank to the confines of the ranch, the small cabin a fragile bulwark against the vast, threatening landscape. The tension between them, which had eased during the creation of the forged map, returned, stretched taut by the enforced proximity and the unspoken dread of their necessary trip to redemption. By the third day, the storm broke. It did not arrive with a gentle preamble of a summer shower. It descended like a hammer blow. The sky turned a churning, malevolent gray, and the wind began to howl, a low, keening sound that rose to a shriek as it tore across the open prairie. It rattled the single glass pane in its frame and found every crack in the log walls, filling the cabin with a symphony of drafts and moans. Soon, the rain followed. Not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets that lashed against the sod roof and turned the hard-packed earth outside into a sea of red mud. It was a violent primal force, erasing the world beyond their walls, isolating them completely. Tom had spent the day securing the ranch. He'd checked on the horses in the barn, reinforced a loose section of the corral fence, and brought in a large stack of firewood. Now, as darkness fell prematurely, he sat at the table, methodically cleaning his pistol, the metallic clicks of the cylinder a small, sharp counterpoint to the storm's roar. Evelyn sat by the hearth, the fire Tom had built blazing hot, its light dancing on the rough-hewn walls. She tried to mend a tear in her shawl, but her hands trembled. The storm was unnerving, its raw power a terrifying reminder of how insignificant they were. But it was more than that. The storm was an external manifestation of the turmoil inside her. And inside this cabin, it was stripping away all pretense, leaving them with nothing but the truth of their situation, two isolated souls, trapped together against a hostile world. The fire spit and crackled. The wind screamed. "You're not afraid of the storm," she said, the words coming out before she could stop them. It wasn't a question. Tom looked up from his work, his hands still. The firelight carved deep shadows into the planes of his face. "No," he said. "The wind doesn't have an agenda. The rain doesn't hold a grudge. It's just weather. It passes." He paused, his gaze distant. "It's people I've learned to be afraid of." His honesty was a rare and startling thing. It invited a confidence of her own. "I used to love storms in Philadelphia," she mused, her needle forgotten in her lap. "I would watch the lightning from my bedroom window. It felt dramatic, exciting, but I was safe. There were thick walls and other houses all around. The world couldn't really touch me." She looked around the small, buffeted cabin. "Out here, you feel every gust. You feel how thin the walls really are." He didn't reply, but he had stopped his cleaning. He was listening. The intensity of his focus was a palpable thing. A particularly violent gust of wind slammed against the cabin, and the entire structure seemed to groan in protest. The lamp on the table flickered wildly. A deafening crack of thunder followed, so close it vibrated through the floorboards and up Evelyn's spine. She flinched, a small, involuntary gasp escaping her lips. In that moment, she saw something in Tom's face. It wasn't fear of the storm. It was a deeper, older pain, an echo of a different kind of violence. The careful mask of stoicism he wore every day had cracked, and beneath it was a raw, aching vulnerability. His knuckles were white where he gripped the disassembled pistol. "I hate thunder," he said, his voice quiet, almost lost in the gale. He pushed the pieces of the gun away from him and stood, walking to the hearth. He stood beside her, staring down into the flames, his tall frame casting a long, dancing shadow behind him. He seemed to need the fire's warmth, its wild, living light. "The last time I heard thunder like this," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "was the night I lost my family." Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The empty house, the scar, the deep well of sadness in his eyes, it all clicked into a place of terrible understanding. She remained perfectly still, sensing that any word, any movement, would shatter the fragile trust of the moment. "It wasn't a storm," he continued, his gaze locked on the fire. "It was a raid. Men looking for, it doesn't matter what they were looking for, an excuse. My wife, Sarah, she was brave. My son, little Eli, he was only 6. The words were torn from him, each one a piece of a story he had clearly never told aloud. They set fire to the barn. The sound, the roar of it, it was like a constant roll of thunder. "I got this." He unconsciously touched the front of his shirt, where she knew the scar lay hidden trying to get to them. "But I was too late. I was too late." He fell silent. The only sounds were the raging storm and the roar of the fire in the hearth. All the questions she'd had about him were answered in that one devastating confession. The hollowed-out man, the empty house, the walls he built around himself, they were all monuments to that night of fire and thunder. He was a man who had lost everything he held dear, and now he had taken her in. Another person to protect, another potential loss. The weight of his offer, the true depth of the risk he was taking for her, settled on Evelyn with crushing force. He wasn't just risking his life, he was risking the fragile peace he had built over the ruins of his heart. Overwhelmed with an emotion she couldn't name, gratitude, sorrow, a fierce, protective tenderness, she reached out. Her hand, small and calloused now from her work, came to rest gently on his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its frantic, powerful beat through the thick cotton of his shirt, a wild and steady rhythm beneath her palm. It was the beat of a life that had endured the unthinkable and continued on. She looked from his chest up to his face. His eyes were filled with a terrible, unshed grief. He was so much more than the quiet, stoic man she had seen. He was a universe of pain and resilience, of loss and unwavering principle. The sheer scale of him, of his sorrow, his strength, his quiet courage was overwhelming. "You're so big," she murmured, the words an awestruck whisper. It was not his height or his shoulders she spoke of, but the immense gravity of his soul, the sheer, solid presence of him in the world. His gaze dropped from the fire to her face, his grief-stricken eyes locking with hers. He saw no pity in her expression, only a profound, heartbreaking understanding. The storm outside raged, and a storm of equal ferocity raged between them. He slowly raised his hand and cupped her jaw, his thumb stroking her cheek. His touch was not rough, but it was not gentle either. It was absolute, a touch that spoke of a desperate, vital need for connection. He leaned down, and she rose on her toes to meet him. The kiss was not soft or tentative. It was a collision, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of death and memory. It was the taste of rain and wood smoke, of sorrow and survival. It was a long, deep kiss that held all the unspoken words, all the shared fears, all the burgeoning hope that had grown in the silent spaces between them. It was a drowning, a rescue, a promise made in the heart of the storm. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and the world seemed to hold its breath. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. The thunder rolled again. Farther away this time, the worst of the storm was passing. "All of me is yours," Tom whispered, his voice thick and raw. It was not a claim, but a vow. It was the opening of a door he had long bolted shut. He was offering her not just his protection, but his trust, his history, his broken heart. He was giving her the truth of himself, the most valuable thing he had left. The sun rose the next morning into a world washed clean. The air was crisp and cool, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The prairie steamed in the morning light, and the scent of rain-soaked earth and wet sage filled the air. A fragile peace had settled over the land, mirroring the quiet understanding that now existed within the cabin's walls. Evelyn stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the fresh, clean air. Everything felt new, possible. She looked out across the land, her gaze sweeping the horizon. And then she saw it. On the crest of a low ridge, miles away but perfectly clear in the sharp morning air, was the silhouette of a man on a horse. He was motionless, a stark black shape against the rising sun. He was not passing through, he was watching. The fragile peace of the morning shattered. The storm had passed, but the war had just arrived. The watcher on the ridge was gone by the time Tom joined her, but his presence lingered, a poison in the clean morning air. Tom's eyes, trained to read the faintest signs, scanned the distant crest. "He's not alone," he said, his voice a low growl. "A scout. He's seen the ranch, seen us. He'll report back." The fragile intimacy born in the storm receded, replaced by the stark, cold calculus of survival. The vow whispered in the dark, "All of me is yours," now felt less like a promise of love and more like a shared sentence. His past, her future, their present, it was all bound together, a target for the men who were coming. They needed to get to town, but now the trip was no longer just about supplies. It was a reconnaissance mission. A few days later, under a sky of indifferent blue, they rode toward redemption. Tom took a winding, circuitous route through arroyos and low hills, his every sense on high alert. The town felt different. The lazy, watchful stillness had been replaced by a nervous, brittle energy. There were new horses at the saloon's hitching post, expensive animals with branded saddlebags. And there were new men, hard-faced men who wore their guns with an easy familiarity, their eyes sweeping over everything with a look of bored appraisal. They weren't cowboys or prospectors. They were predators. As Tom and Evelyn dismounted in front of Henderson's Mercantile, a man stepped out of the saloon. He was of average height but carried himself with an expansive, arrogant confidence. He had a clean-shaven, handsome face that was somehow made unpleasant by a pair of cold, pale blue eyes. He wore a tailored duster and a polished holster. He looked at Tom, his gaze lingering for a moment, then shifted to Evelyn. A flicker of something amusement, possessiveness in his eyes before he turned and went back inside. "Cole Rourke," Tom said under his breath, the name an exhalation of stale, dangerous air. Inside the store, Mr. Henderson was a changed man. The wary neutrality was gone, replaced by a fawning, anxious demeanor as he served one of Rourke's men. He barely acknowledged Tom and Evelyn, his eyes refusing to meet theirs. When it was their turn, his hands shook as he measured out flour and coffee. "There's talk, Tom," he mumbled, his voice low, his back to the room. "Rourke's buying rounds for everyone. Says he's here on behalf of a respectable businessman from the East. Says a woman stole some valuable papers from him." He risked a quick, fearful glance at Evelyn. "They're saying you're harboring a thief." "And you believe them?" Henderson. Tom's voice was dangerously quiet. Henderson flinched. "It's not what I believe. It's the gold. Tom, Croft's gold. Rourke's paying $50 a day for riders. Men are signing on. They see an easy payday, not the trouble behind it." He pushed their supplies across the counter. "You should be careful. The whole town's turned." They left with their meager supplies and a heavy sense of isolation. The community, however flawed, that might have offered some measure of protection had been bought and paid for. They were an island, and the tide was rising. Confirmation came a few days later in the form of Ben, Tom's only hired hand, an old, wizened man with a face like a dried apple and eyes that had seen 70 years of sun and trouble. He rode in from the line cabin where he stayed, his demeanor grim. "They cut the south fence. Tom," he said, dismounting with a slow creak of old bones, "ran off a dozen head toward the Badlands. I tracked him for a bit. It was Rourke's men. They weren't trying to steal the horses, just scatter them, cause trouble." Ben's gaze fell on Evelyn, who was standing in the doorway of the cabin. His look was not unkind, but it was searching. He was a man fiercely loyal to Tom, and she was the source of this new danger. That night, a strange, flickering light appeared on the horizon. It was in the direction of Ben's line cabin. Tom and Ben saddled up and rode out, their faces grim silhouettes against the moonless sky. Evelyn was left alone in the house, a rifle resting across her lap, her ears straining to hear over the pounding of her own heart. The empty cabin felt less like a shelter and more like a trap. They returned just before dawn, their horses lathered, the smell of soot and smoke clinging to their clothes. The line cabin was a pile of smoldering ash. The attacks grew bolder, more personal. A week later, they found one of Tom's best mares by the river, her leg broken. She had to be put down. It was a cruel, wasteful act, designed not just to harm their livelihood but to break their spirit. Each act of sabotage was a message: we are everywhere. We can touch you whenever we want, and no one will help you. A new face of support appeared, as quiet and unexpected as a desert bloom. Maria, a widow from town who had known Tom's wife, rode out one afternoon under the pretense of delivering a basket of eggs. She was a stout, serene woman whose calm exterior hid a spine of steel. "The town is sick with gold fever," she told them, her dark eyes filled with a sad wisdom as she stood in the kitchen. "They listen to Rourke's poison, but not everyone. Some of us remember the man you are. Thomas, we remember Sarah." She placed a hand on Evelyn's arm, a gesture of quiet solidarity. "Be strong, little bird. A hawk is watching over you." Her visit was a balm, but it couldn't change the grim reality. The circle was tightening. That evening, as the shadows grew long and painted the prairie in hues of purple and orange, Tom finally broke. He watched Evelyn as she tended to the small, stubborn plants in her garden. She had coaxed life from the unforgiving soil, and the patch of green was a small but vibrant act of defiance. He saw the strength in her, the courage she had found, and it terrified him. He had watched one brave woman die in fire and thunder. He could not, would not, watch another. "You have to leave, Evelyn," he said, his voice devoid of all warmth. He stood by the corral fence, not looking at her. She straightened up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She had been dreading these words. Leave and go where they're watching the town. They're watching the trails." "I know a way," he said, his tone flat, final. "A path through the high canyons. It will take you north. You can get a stagecoach in Willow Creek. I'll give you all the money I have. It will be enough to get you to San Francisco, somewhere far away where Croft can't find you." She walked toward him, her heart sinking. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. He was shutting her out, making a decision for her, just as her father had, just as Silas Croft had tried to do. "You want to send me away," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of hurt and anger. "I want to keep you safe," he bit back, turning to face her. The agony in his eyes was stark. "Don't you understand? They burned Ben's cabin. They crippled my best mare. These are warnings. The next time, they won't aim for my property. They will come for you. And His voice broke. I won't bury someone I care for again. Not again." The raw wound of his past was laid bare between them. He was not pushing her away out of anger or regret. He was trying to save her, and in doing so, trying to save himself from a pain he knew he could not survive a second time. Her own fear threatened to overwhelm her. The thought of being alone again, a fugitive on the run, was paralyzing. The path he offered was the sensible one, the safe one. But as she looked at him, at this man who had offered her shelter and then his heart, she knew that safety was no longer what she wanted most. The freedom she had craved was not about being alone and unburdened. It was about choosing where to stand and with whom. She closed the distance between them, her gaze unwavering. "No," she said, her voice clear and strong. He stared at her, uncomprehending. "What?" "I said no," she repeated. "I spent months running. Tom, I ran until I had nothing left. I will not run again, not from Croft, and not from them." She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening into something unbreakable. "You took me in when I was a stranger. You stood up for me when no one else would. You shared your home, your food, your truth. You didn't try to own me. You offered me a choice. And this is my choice." She reached out and took his hand, her dirt-stained fingers lacing with his. "My fight is here now, with you. I choose to stay. I choose to fight beside you." He looked down at their joined hands, then up at her face. He saw no fear in her eyes, only a fierce, unwavering determination that mirrored his own. He had offered her an escape, and she had offered him an army of two. The walls around his heart, the ones he had so carefully constructed from grief and solitude, crumbled to dust. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. He didn't bother to wipe it away. He simply squeezed her hand, a silent acceptance, a surrender to a future he was terrified to embrace but could no longer deny. They stood there for a long time as the sun bled away below the horizon, the first stars beginning to prick the darkening sky. A fragile sense of peace, of rightness, settled over them. They had made their stand. When they turned to walk back to the cabin, they saw it. Resting on the rough-hewn wooden step of the front door was a small, crudely tied bundle of wildflowers. They were black-eyed Susans, their yellow petals already wilting, their dark centers like accusing eyes. Tom stopped dead, the blood draining from his face. A violent tremor ran through his body. Evelyn looked from the flowers to his face, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. "What is it?" she whispered. He couldn't speak for a moment, his throat working, when he finally found his voice. It was a strangled, broken sound she had never heard before. They were Sarah's favorite. He said, "She planted them in the garden." The withered bouquet was not a warning. It was a desecration. It was a message of profound cruelty. A statement that his enemies not only knew his weakness, but would take pleasure in twisting the knife in his oldest wound. They were not just coming for the map or for her. They were coming for his soul. The choice had been made. The war was no longer avoidable. It was already on their doorstep. The desecration of the flowers changed the air, the quiet of the ranch. Once a source of peace became a coiled, watchful thing, heavy with unspoken finality. For 3 days, they moved in a state of grim preparation. The night of the new moon was an ink blot, a sliver of silver in a black sky offering no comfort. There was no wind, and the silence was so profound it felt like a pressure against the ears. Inside the cabin, the 3 of them sat around the table. The lamp turned low. Tom laid out his plan, his voice a quiet, steady current in the sea of tension. He spoke not of victory, but of survival. "They'll use fire," he said, looking at Ben. "They know the horses are my life. They'll expect me to run out to the barn. That's when they'll close the trap." Ben, his face a roadmap of wrinkles in the lamplight, nodded slowly. "It's a coward's plan, but it's a good one. So we use it," Tom continued. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes holding hers, communicating a world of trust and fear. "The house is our only fortress. We've boarded the windows, leaving only small firing slits. We have water, ammunition. We can hold out." He then slid the forged map across the table. It lay there, a piece of paper imbued with the power to save or to kill. But not if they all come at once. We have to divide them. Ben reached out a gnarled hand and pulled the map toward him. He looked at Tom, his old eyes clear and resolved. "I'll do it," he said. It wasn't a question. "Ben," Tom started, his voice thick. "There's no one else." "Son," the old man said gently, "I'm the best rider you've got, and this old horse of mine can still outrun their fancy town-bought stock for a while. I'll take the map, make a run for it from the back canyon when the fire starts. They'll see a man with a leather pouch breaking away in the confusion. Rourke can't risk losing it. He'll have to send men after me." It was a suicide mission. They all knew it. He would draw a portion of Rourke's men away, leading them on a wild chase into the darkness. But he would be alone, and they would be many. Evelyn felt a protest rise in her throat, but the look on Ben's face silenced her. It was a look of profound peace, of a man who had made his choice and was content with the price. This was his stand, too. Tom clasped the old man's shoulder, a long, silent farewell passing between them. "Ride hard, my friend," he said, his voice husky. "Always do," Ben replied with a faint, crooked smile. He tucked the map into a leather satchel, stood up, and walked out of the cabin without a backward glance, disappearing into the oppressive darkness. An hour later, the world exploded in light and sound. A blooming orange flower of flame erupted from the barn, devouring the dry timber with a hungry roar that shattered the night silence. Shouts and the thunder of hooves echoed from the darkness as Rourke's men began to close their circle. Inside the cabin, Tom stood at a firing slit, his rifle steady. "Now," he breathed. In the flickering, chaotic light of the fire, they saw him, a lone rider, breaking from the line of willows by the river, heading east toward the canyons. It was Ben, his small frame hunched low over the neck of his horse, the leather satchel clearly visible. There were confused shouts from the attackers, a moment of indecision. Then, just as Tom had predicted, a group of about half a dozen riders broke away from the main force, their forms stark silhouettes against the inferno, giving chase to the fleeing figure. Cole Rourke had taken the bait. "He did it," Evelyn whispered, a mixture of awe and grief in her voice. "He did," Tom said, his voice tight. "Now we make it count." The real assault began. The remaining dozen men, led by a burly second-in-command, advanced on the house, using the burning barn for cover from the night's darkness. The first bullet splintered the log next to Tom's head, showering him with wood fragments. He didn't flinch. He aimed his rifle, squeezed the trigger, and one of the advancing shadows crumpled to the ground. The cabin became a crucible of noise, smoke, and terror. Bullets thudded into the thick log walls like angry fists. The air grew thick with the smell of gunpowder and burning pine. A stray ember, carried on a sudden, fickle breeze, landed on the sod roof and began to smolder. "The roof!" Tom yelled. The wind, their unseen enemy, was now actively trying to burn them alive, while Tom kept up a steady, calming fire from the window. Evelyn sprang into action. She grabbed a bucket, filled it from the water barrel inside, and unbarred the back door for a split second, scrambling up the small ladder that led to the roof. The heat was intense, the smoke a choking, blinding cloud. She doused the smoldering patch, the water hissing as it hit the hot earth. She could hear bullets whining past her in the dark. Scrambling back down, she barred the door, her heart hammering, her lungs aching. She became a vital part of their defense. She was no longer the lady from Philadelphia. She was a soldier in a desperate siege. When Tom's rifle was empty, another was in his hands, freshly loaded by her. Her hands, scraped and raw, moved with a feverish efficiency. She tore strips from a bedsheet for bandages, though they had not yet needed them. She kept her mind clear, her fear a cold, hard stone in her gut. Not a blinding panic. She was his eyes and ears on the other side of the house, calling out movements, her voice steady and clear over the din. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. Tom was a master of his craft, his shots measured, his commands calm. He wasn't fighting with rage, but with a cold, precise purpose. He aimed to wound, to disable, to drive them back, not to slaughter. Every shot was a defense of his home, of the woman beside him, of the memory of the family he had lost on a similar night of fire and violence. Rourke's lieutenant, a big bearded man named Jensen, was growing frustrated. Their frontal assault was failing. "Burn them out," he roared. "Bring the torches." 2 men ran toward the house, holding burning brands snatched from the inferno of the barn. Tom's rifle barked twice, and both men went down, their torches sputtering out in the dirt. Enraged, Jensen decided to end it himself. With a guttural yell, he charged the front door, a heavy axe in his hands. He swung it with brutal force, the heavy blade biting deep into the thick wood. The door shuddered, but held. He swung again, and a crack appeared. "He's coming through," Evelyn cried. Tom left the firing slit and stood before the door. Reloading his pistol, "Stay back," he commanded. The axe splintered the door a 3rd time, and Jensen kicked the shattered remains inward. He stormed into the cabin, a giant, menacing figure framed by the firelight, his eyes wild with bloodlust. He saw Tom and raised the axe to swing. Tom fired. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Jensen staggered, a red stain blossoming on his shoulder. But he didn't fall. He roared in pain and lunged forward. There was no time to fire again. Tom dropped the pistol and met the charge, using his lighter frame to deflect the man's momentum, sending them both crashing into the table. They wrestled on the floor, a grunting, desperate struggle of muscle and will. Jensen was stronger, his thick arms like bands of iron. He pinned Tom, his hands going for his throat. Tom's face began to turn purple, his breath choked off. Evelyn screamed. She grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the hearth, and with all the strength in her body, she swung it, bringing it down on the side of Jensen's head. There was a sickening crack. The big man grunted, his eyes rolling back, and his grip on Tom's throat loosened. He slumped sideways, unconscious. Tom gasped for air, scrambling away from the downed man. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. The loss of their leader broke the attacker's will. The fusillade from outside slackened, then stopped. There were shouts, the sound of men mounting their horses. They had failed. The price had become too high. Tom got to his feet and peered through the broken door. In the distance, he could see them, a disorganized rabble, retreating back toward town, their courage extinguished. Victory! But the silence they left behind was filled with the roar of the still-burning barn and the deafening absence of Ben. As the first gray light of dawn began to stain the eastern sky, the fire finally began to die, its hunger sated. The barn was gone, reduced to a blackened, skeletal frame and a mountain of glowing embers. The ranch was scarred, littered with the evidence of the night's brutal fight. Tom and Evelyn stood in the shattered doorway of the cabin, their faces smudged with soot, their bodies bruised and aching. They were alive. They had won. But their eyes were fixed on the eastern canyons, where Ben had ridden into the darkness. There was no sign of a rider returning. The victory felt hollow, bought at an unbearable price. The smoke that rose from the ruins of the barn mingled with the morning mist, and it smelled of ash and loss and the heavy cost of justice. The sun rose on a battlefield. The light, usually a promise of warmth and life, served only to illuminate the night's devastation. The barn was a blackened skeleton, its ribs of charred timber stark against the pale blue sky. A funereal plume of smoke still curled lazily upwards, the only movement in the preternaturally still morning. The air, washed clean by the storm, was now tainted with the acrid smell of burnt wood and cordite. Victory was a bitter ash on the tongue. They moved through the ruins like ghosts, their bodies aching, their souls scraped raw. Evelyn tended to a long, shallow gash on Tom's forearm, her touch gentle, her movements methodical. Tom submitted to her care, his gaze fixed on the eastern horizon, toward the jagged maw of the canyons where Ben had disappeared. The silence between them was not the comfortable quiet of allies, but the taut, fragile silence of shared trauma, a space too brittle for words. When she had finished, he stood. "I have to go," he said, his voice a rasp. She didn't ask where. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "Be careful." He saddled his roan, the creak of the leather unnaturally loud in the morning quiet. He rode out not with the fluid grace she was used to, but with a stiff, rigid posture. A man on his way to a hanging. Evelyn watched him go, a small, solitary figure in a vast, wounded landscape, until he was just a speck, and then nothing. The waiting was its own form of torture. She cleaned the cabin, sweeping up the splinters of the shattered door, righting the overturned table. She gathered the spent cartridges, each one a small, brass testament to the night's violence. The unconscious form of Jensen had been dragged outside and tied to a fence post, a piece of human wreckage left by the receding tide of war. Every task was a way to keep her mind from following Tom, from imagining what he would find. He returned in the late afternoon. The sun was slanting low, casting the world in a melancholy gold. She saw him coming from a long way off, a single rider moving at a funereal pace. He was not alone. Ben's old horse, riderless, its reins looped over Tom's saddle horn, trotted faithfully alongside the roan. The sight broke the dam of her composure. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips before she forced it back down. She walked out to meet him as he dismounted, her face a mask of resolute calm. She would not add her grief to the burden he was already carrying. His face was carved from stone, his eyes hollowed out pits of exhaustion and sorrow. He didn't speak. He simply handed her the leather satchel he'd taken from Ben's horse. Inside, untouched, was the forged map. Ben had done his job. He had led them away, and he had paid the price. "We'll bury him by the cottonwoods," Tom said, his voice toneless. He liked the sound of the leaves in the wind. They worked together, digging the grave in the soft earth near the riverbank, where a small grove of cottonwood trees stood as silent, rustling sentinels The rhythmic scrape and thud of the shovel was a mournful percussion. The sun dipped lower, bathing the scene in a light that was both beautiful and unbearably sad. When the task was done, Tom gently lowered Ben's blanket-wrapped form into the earth. He stood over the grave, his hat in his hands, his head bowed. Evelyn stood beside him, giving him the dignity of a silent farewell. For a long time, the only sound was the whispering of the cottonwood leaves. Then a tremor ran through Tom's powerful frame. His shoulders began to shake. The stone facade crumbled, and the dam of a decade's worth of unshed grief finally broke. A raw, guttural sound was torn from his throat, the sound of a soul breaking apart. He sank to his knees, his hands covering his face, and he wept. He wept for Ben, the loyal friend who had died for his fight. He wept for the wife and son he had lost to another night of fire and violence. He wept for the crushing, unrelenting weight of his own survival. "It should have been me," he choked out, the words mangled by grief. "It's always me who walks away." He looked up at her, his face a mask of anguish, his eyes pleading for an answer he knew she couldn't give. "There's a poison in me. Evelyn, a curse. Everyone I care for, everyone I love, they die. Sarah, Eli, and now Ben. I brought this on him. I let him ride out to save me." His pain was a physical thing, a vortex that threatened to pull them both down into despair. Evelyn's heart ached for him, but she knew that pity was a useless balm. What he needed was not pity, but truth. She knelt in the dirt beside him, her dress forgotten. She did not touch him, not yet. She waited until his raw sobs quieted to ragged gasps for air. "Look at me, Tom," she said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through his haze of self-recrimination. He slowly lowered his hands, his eyes red-rimmed and lost. "The guilt you feel is not yours to carry," she said, her words measured and deliberate. "It belongs to Silas Croft, whose greed started all of this. It belongs to Cole Rourke, whose cruelty placed those withered flowers on our doorstep. It belongs to the men who chose to follow them, who chose violence for a handful of gold." She finally reached out, her hand gently touching his jaw, turning his face toward her. "You are not a poison. You are the man who stood against it. Ben knew that. He didn't die to save you. He died to stand with you. He made a choice, a brave, honorable choice. Do not dishonor his memory by trying to steal that choice from him and claim it as your failure." He stared at her, the torrent of his grief momentarily checked by the force of her conviction. "As for curses," she continued, her voice softening, "I don't believe in them. I believe in sunrises. I believe that love isn't the absence of fear or pain. It's the choice we make, every single morning, to stand together again, especially when we are afraid." She gave him a gentle, watery smile. "It's choosing to rebuild the barn. It's choosing to plant a garden. It's choosing to face whatever comes next. Together, the crime belongs to the guilty. Tom, the future belongs to us." She held out her hand. "Stand up with me." He looked at her hand, then back to her face. He saw no judgment there, only an unwavering strength, a gentle but absolute faith. He took her hand, his large, calloused fingers closing around hers. She pulled, and he rose, slowly, unsteadily, to his feet. He was still broken, but he was no longer on his knees. He was standing. It was in that moment, as they stood together by the fresh grave, that they heard it, the sound of wagons. Not one, but several, their wheels creaking, accompanied by the slow, deliberate plod of many horses. Tom's first instinct was to reach for his pistol, but these were not the sounds of an attack. He and Evelyn looked at each other, then turned toward the ranch. A slow procession was making its way up the trail from town. It was not a posse of aggressors, but a somber parade of penitents. The town's sheriff, a man named Miller, whom Tom had always known to be more of a politician than a lawman, led the way. Behind him were 2 wagons, piled high with fresh-cut lumber. Following them were a dozen men on foot and on horseback. Henderson from the Mercantile, the blacksmith, and other faces from Redemption. Maria was there, too, her presence a silent benediction. The procession came to a halt a respectful distance from the cabin. Sheriff Miller dismounted, his hat in his hands, his usual bluster replaced by a heavy, hangdog shame. "Tom," he began, his voice rough. We heard what happened. We saw Rourke and his men ride back in. They were beaten. Some of them didn't come back at all." He took a deep breath. "We were wrong. We let that man's gold blind us. We listened to his lies and we turned our backs on a good man, on a neighbor." He gestured to the wagons. "It's not enough, I know that, but it's a start. We've come to help you rebuild. We've come to fix what we can." Tom stood there, flanked by Evelyn, and stared at the collection of his neighbors. He saw the shame in their eyes, the genuine regret. He saw Henderson, who had once pretended not to see him, now meeting his gaze with a look of direct, humble apology. They had failed him, but they had come back. For a man who had lived in self-imposed exile for so long, the sight was almost more overwhelming than the battle itself. He had forgotten what a community looked like. He gave a single, slow nod of acceptance. It was all the answer they needed. The work began. The sound of hammers and saws replaced the echo of gunfire. The men of Redemption, who had stood by while his ranch was terrorized, now sweated under the afternoon sun, hoisting beams and nailing planks. Maria and the other women who had come organized a makeshift kitchen, providing water and food. Evelyn worked alongside them, no longer an outsider, but a part of this strange, evolving community. She passed tools, carried water, and offered a quiet word of encouragement, her presence a testament to the stand Tom had taken. As the sun began to set, casting its final golden rays across the valley, a new frame stood where the old barn had been. It was a skeleton, but a skeleton of hope. The house was no longer just a set of walls. It was the heart of a home that was slowly, painfully, being rebuilt by the very people who had allowed it to be attacked. That evening, Tom and Evelyn sat on the cabin steps, a plate of food shared between them. The air was cool, and the sounds of the departing wagons faded into the distance. They were alone again, but the nature of their solitude had changed forever. "They'll be back tomorrow," Tom said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder. "Yes," Evelyn said. She looked at the new frame, a dark shape against the star-dusted sky. "Rourke and his men are gone from town. Maria told me they rode out this morning." The immediate threat was gone, but the larger shadow of Silas Croft still loomed in the east. "We're not safe yet," Tom said, voicing the thought. "No," she agreed. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the weariness of the past days settling deep into her bones. "But we're not running either." He put his arm around her, pulling her close. "No," he said, his voice a quiet vow in the vast, peaceful dark. "We're not running. This is our home." The future was an unknown territory, as vast and dangerous as the one on her father's maps. But this time, she would not be navigating it alone. The days that followed were filled with the sounds of creation, the sharp report of hammers, the rhythmic rasp of saws, the low murmur of men's voices joined in common purpose. These sounds were a healing balm on the raw wounds of the ranch, the community of Redemption, awakened from its gold-induced slumber, worked with the quiet diligence of penitence. They were not just rebuilding a barn. They were rebuilding trust. They were mending the social fabric they had allowed to be torn. Tom was a different man among them. The solitary, watchful figure who had always held himself apart was gone. In his place was a quiet leader. He worked alongside the others, his movements economical and expert. But now he offered a word of advice to a younger man struggling with a joint, or shared a dipper of water with Henderson, a silent gesture of forgiveness that was more powerful than any speech. He was not giving orders. He was sharing knowledge. The town began to see him not as Greyhawk, the dangerous man who lived on the edge of their world, but as Tom, their neighbor, a man who had bled to defend a principle they had been willing to sell. Evelyn was the heart of this new community. She moved between the workers, her presence a source of steady grace. She organized the meals with Maria, turning the sparse cabin into a place of welcome. She learned the names of the men's children, listened to their stories, and in doing so, she wove herself into the life of the town she had once feared. She was no longer the outsider, the trouble that had ridden in on the wind. She was the woman who had stood her ground, the woman who, alongside Tom, had reminded them of who they were meant to be. The new barn rose from the ashes of the old, larger and stronger than before. Its fresh-cut pine timbers smelled of resilience and new beginnings. On the day the final roof plank was nailed into place, a spontaneous cheer went up from the men. It was a celebration not just of a finished job, but of a restored community. A week later, Sheriff Miller rode out again. This time, he did not come with shame in his eyes, but with a letter in his hand. It had arrived by stagecoach, addressed to Evelyn. The postmark was from Philadelphia. Her hands trembled as she took it. It was from a lawyer, an old friend of her father's. The language was dry and legal, but the message was a thunderclap of relief. Silas Croft was facing a federal investigation. His rapacious business dealings, his habit of acquiring assets through intimidation and legally dubious contracts, had finally caught the attention of men more powerful than himself. His empire of greed was beginning to crumble under its own weight. He was entangled in lawsuits and inquiries, his attention and his resources drawn away from the distant West. The letter ended with a simple, powerful sentence: "You will not be troubled by him again." The shadow that had chased her across a continent had finally dissolved, not in a blaze of gunfire, but in a quiet storm of ink and paper back east, the justice of the world. It turned out was sometimes a slow, grinding thing, but it ground exceedingly fine. That evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in strokes of rose and gold, Tom and Evelyn walked hand in hand to a small, cleared spot by the river. In Tom's other hand, he carried her father's leather portfolio. He built a small, careful fire, its flames reaching up into the twilight. Evelyn unrolled the maps one last time. They were beautiful, a testament to a life spent in pursuit of knowledge, of understanding the earth's secrets. She thought of her father, of his passion and his dreams. He had not created these to be a source of conflict and bloodshed. He had created them out of love for the land itself. "He would have wanted this," she said, her voice soft. She took the first map, the one that had started it all, the one depicting the canyon of the Stone Bear and its glittering, cursed veins of quartz. She held it over the small fire. For a moment, her father's neat script was illuminated by the flames, a final, glowing farewell. Then she let it go. The paper curled, blackened, and turned to ash, the ink lines of canyons and mountains dissolving into nothing. They fed the fire, map by map, until the entire portfolio, the source of so much pain and hope, was gone. They were not destroying her father's legacy. They were freeing it from the stain of human greed. They were choosing a future built not on a treasure buried in the ground, but on the hard-won riches they had found in each other and in the community they had helped to heal. As the last embers of the maps died down, a great weight lifted from Evelyn's soul. She was finally, truly free. Life settled into a new rhythm, as steady and peaceful as the flow of the river. The ranch thrived. The new barn filled with hay, and the herd, slowly recovered, grew strong in the pastures. Tom was no longer just a horsebreaker. He was a mentor, taking on a few young men from the town to teach them his craft. His quiet patience a greater lesson than any technique. One warm summer night, months later, they sat by a small campfire near the house. The stars in the vast, dark sky were brilliant, hard points of diamond light. The air was filled with the scent of sage and the gentle chirping of crickets. The silence between them was no longer a void to be filled, but a space of deep, shared contentment. "Do you ever miss it?" Tom asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet. the city, the life you left behind. Evelyn looked into the dancing flames. I miss the memory of my father. She said, but the life, no, that life was a beautiful cage. I didn't know it until I came here. I thought freedom was about escaping, about being left alone, but it's not. She turned to him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. It's about choosing who to stand with. It's about building something that matters, even when it's hard. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. We built this, he said, his gaze sweeping over the dark shape of the house, the sturdy silhouette of the new barn, the land that stretched out around them, you, me, Ben, even the town. We all built it. She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid, steady strength of him. I was so afraid that night of the storm, she confessed, but not just of the thunder. I was afraid of what I was starting to feel for you, afraid of needing someone again. He turned his head, his lips brushing against her hair. That night, when I told you about my family, I was sure you would run. I was sure the poison in my past would drive you away. He paused. When you stayed, when you chose to fight, you saved me. Evelyn, you saved me from the ghost I had become. His words were a quiet testament to the journey they had taken. The vow he had made in the heart of the storm had been a desperate opening of a locked-down heart. But now, it was something more. It was the foundation of their life, reaffirmed not in crisis, but in the quiet peace of a summer evening. All of me is yours, she whispered, echoing his words from that night, making the promise her own. It was not a surrender, but a declaration, a statement of a love that was a conscious choice, made every day, in the brilliant light of the sun and the quiet dark of the night. He kissed her then, a slow, deep kiss that tasted of wood smoke and forever. It was a kiss that held the memory of loss, the grit of survival, and the profound, unshakable certainty of home. As the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, it touched the land with a delicate, rosy glow, a sound, like distant rolling thunder, carried on the morning breeze. It was the sound of horses. From the new barn, their herd, a vibrant, living river of brown and black and roan, burst forth into the wide-open pasture. They ran for the sheer joy of it, their manes and tails streaming, their hooves drumming a powerful, hopeful rhythm on the earth. The sun climbed higher, bathing the river bar in the clean, bright promise of a new day, a new life, a future as wide and open as the western sky. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment where you're listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.